Los Angeles, June 24th, 2009. The evening air hung heavy with anticipation as sunset cast long shadows across the expansive grounds of 100 North Carrollwood Drive. Behind the ornate gates of this rented Holmby Hills mansion, Michael Jackson, perhaps the most famous and simultaneously least understood human being on the planet, moved through the final hours of his life, unaware that by this time tomorrow, the world would be forever changed. At 50 years old, his slender frame still moved with the fluid grace that had helped define pop culture for 3 decades, though those closest to him noticed the increasing fragility beneath the practiced precision of his movements. Exhaustion clung to him like a shadow, visible in the slight stoop of his shoulders as he descended the grand staircase, in the deepening lines around his eyes that no amount of stage makeup could fully conceal during rehearsals. This wasn't supposed to be the end, but a beginning, the carefully orchestrated comeback that would remind the world of the artistic brilliance that had sometimes been overshadowed by the tabloid caricature his life had become. After years of self-imposed exile following his 2005 trial and acquittal, Michael was preparing for This Is It, 50 sold-out concerts at London's O2 Arena, his triumphant return to the stage that had always been his truest home. The massive production, with its groundbreaking technology and meticulously designed set pieces, represented not just a professional resurgence, but a personal redemption, a chance to reclaim his narrative, to shift the public's focus from the swirling controversies back to the music that had touched hundreds of millions of lives across generational and geographical boundaries. In the mansion's expansive living room, converted into an impromptu rehearsal space, Michael worked with his choreographer Travis Payne, running through movements for Smooth Criminal with characteristic perfectionism, stopping frequently to adjust a gesture to refine a transition between steps. Though the hour grew late and his medical team had advised rest before tomorrow's scheduled rehearsal at the Staples Center, Michael pushed on, driven by the internal standard of excellence that had defined his career from those earliest days with the Jackson 5. "It has to be perfect," he said softly, his speaking voice carrying that familiar, gentle quality that seemed so at odds with his powerful stage presence. "They deserve perfect." The they in question wasn't the production team or the concert promoters with their multi-million-dollar investments. It was the fans, the global community that had sustained him through the darkest periods of his life, whose loyalty he viewed not as entitlement, but as a sacred trust requiring his absolute artistic commitment in return. Travis, recognizing the particular intensity in Michael's expression, nodded in understanding. After years of collaboration, he had learned to distinguish between Michael's everyday perfectionism and this deeper, almost spiritual determination that emerged when he felt the full weight of his audience's expectations. As midnight approached, Michael's personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, appeared in the doorway, his presence a reminder of the complex medical regimen that had become an increasingly central part of Michael's daily existence. The chronic insomnia that had plagued him for years had worsened during the intense preparation for the London concerts, the creative adrenaline that fueled his artistic process becoming its own obstacle to the rest his body desperately needed. Murray carried not just his medical bag, but the unspoken authority of someone who held the keys to the precious commodity of sleep that had become so elusive. "Just a little longer," Michael said, not a request but a gentle insistence. Murray hesitated, then nodded, retreating to the adjacent room where he maintained the collection of medications that would later become evidence in his manslaughter trial. This brief interaction, the doctor yielding to the patient, the medical advice subordinated to the artistic imperative, contained within it the tragic seeds of what would unfold in the hours ahead. The boundaries between professional expertise and personal accommodation had blurred dangerously, a pattern that had repeated itself throughout Michael's adult life, as his unparalleled fame distorted the normal relationships that might have provided genuine protection rather than complicity. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from music history. Moments that reveal the humanity behind the headlines, the personal struggles behind the public personas. These glimpses beyond the sensationalism remind us that even our greatest cultural icons navigate the same fundamental human challenges we all face, though often under the distorting pressure of unprecedented fame. Around 1 a.m., Michael finally concluded the rehearsal, thanking Travis with the unfailing politeness that even exhaustion couldn't diminish. His children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, had long since been put to bed by their nanny, Grace Roramba, who had become a stabilizing maternal presence in their lives. Michael climbed the stairs to their rooms, moving quietly to avoid waking them, but unable to resist the ritual of checking on each child before retiring. This nightly practice, this moment of witnessing their peaceful sleep, had become his emotional anchor amid the swirling pressures of the comeback preparations. In these quiet moments, with no audience but his sleeping children, Michael wasn't the king of pop or the tabloid target, but simply a father, a role he had once described as the most important thing I'll ever do. As he gently adjusted the blanket over his youngest son's shoulder, Michael's mind returned to a conversation from earlier that day. During a brief break in rehearsals, his daughter Paris had asked with the directness unique to children, "Daddy, are you scared about the shows?" The question had caught him off guard, not because he hadn't considered his own anxiety about returning to the stage after so long an absence, but because his 11-year-old had perceived it beneath his carefully maintained confidence. Sometimes, he had admitted after a thoughtful pause, but being scared can be good. It means you care about getting it right. She had nodded with surprising seriousness, accepting this wisdom from the father whose artistic life remained largely separate from their carefully protected domestic existence. Returning to his own bedroom suite, Michael found Murray waiting, the familiar routine of his milk, his private term for propofol, the powerful anesthetic that had become his desperate solution to insomnia, already prepared. The tragic irony lay in the simplicity of what Michael sought. Sleep, that most basic human need, that natural state which had become increasingly unattainable as his mind raced with creative ideas, performance details, and the underlying anxiety about whether this massive undertaking would achieve the redemption he so deeply craved. What should have been the most natural of human functions now required the most unnatural of interventions. The medical details of what followed have been exhaustively documented in court records, expert testimonies, and investigative reports. The dangerous cocktail of medications, the inadequate monitoring equipment, the fundamental inappropriateness of administering anesthesia outside a hospital setting. But what these clinical accounts fail to capture is the human element of those final hours. A man of extraordinary gifts and equally extraordinary burdens, seeking the most basic of human needs, sleep, at a cost that would ultimately prove fatal. As the medications took effect, as consciousness began to slip away, Michael's final thoughts remained unknown, unknowable to anyone but himself. Did images of the London concerts dance through his mind? The elaborate stage designs, the reimagined choreography for his greatest hits, the roar of an audience he hadn't heard in years? Did he think of his children, of the future he envisioned for them, of his hopes to one day show them a world they had thus far experienced primarily through the protective filters he had created? Did he reflect on the long, strange journey from Gary, Indiana, to global icon, from the little boy with the supernatural voice to the complicated man whose life had become a battleground between artistic brilliance and personal struggle? These questions remain unanswerable. These final private moments appropriately beyond the reach of even the most intrusive public curiosity. What is known with certainty is that sometime in those early morning hours of June 25th, Michael Jackson, the artist who had revolutionized popular music, dance, and video, who had broken racial barriers on MTV, who had redefined the very concept of global celebrity, took his last breath in a second-floor bedroom of a rented mansion, surrounded not by family or close friends, but by the trappings of a medicalized sleep routine that had become his tragic necessity. The discovery came later that morning. Murray, returning after a prolonged absence during which phone records would later show he was making personal calls, found Michael unresponsive. The details of the frantic resuscitation attempts, the delayed 911 call, the ambulance journey to UCLA Medical Center where Michael was officially pronounced dead at 2:26 p.m. These elements have been recounted in courtrooms and news reports, dissected with clinical precision that strips away the human reality beneath the medical timeline. What was not visible in those official accounts was the deeper tragedy unfolding in parallel with the medical emergency. The devastation of the children who lost their father, of the family who lost their brother and son, of the global community of fans who lost an artist whose work had formed the soundtrack to their lives. The news spread with a particular velocity unique to the digital age, reaching Paris during a telephone conversation, prompting her heart-wrenching public declaration at the memorial service. "Ever since I was born, Daddy has been the best father you could ever imagine. I just want to say I love him so much." These were not the words of fans mourning a distant icon, but of a child grieving her father, a distinction that sometimes became blurred in the media frenzy that followed. The aftermath unfolded with dizzying speed. The global outpouring of grief, the memorial service watched by an estimated 1 billion people worldwide, the investigation that ultimately led to Murray's conviction for involuntary manslaughter, the posthumous concert film, This Is It, assembled from rehearsal footage that showed a performer still in command of his extraordinary gifts even in those final days. The man who had lived his entire life under the distorting lens of fame continued to be defined by external narratives even in death, his complex humanity often reduced to simplified characterizations that failed to capture the full measure of his life and art. What emerged from accounts of those who had been with him during those final days was a portrait more nuanced than the public caricatures had suggested, a man simultaneously driven by perfectionism, yet capable of childlike joy, intensely private yet preparing for the most public of returns, physically fragile yet able to summon remarkable energy when the music began. Kenny Ortega, the director of the This Is It concerts, would later describe Michael's transformation during rehearsals. When the music played, it was like watching a phoenix rise. All the physical discomfort, all the emotional weight, it just fell away, and there was only the artist, only the music. This duality, the painful contrast between the struggle of his private existence and the transcendence of his artistic expression, perhaps defines the tragedy of Michael Jackson's life and death more accurately than any medical report or legal proceeding. The very gifts that allowed him to touch millions of lives, to break barriers of race and genre, to redefine the possibilities of performance, existed in constant tension with the personal challenges that flowed from a childhood sacrificed to early fame, from the isolating effects of unprecedented celebrity, from the physical toll of perfectionism maintained across decades of performance. In the years since his death, as the immediate shock has given way to more measured reflection, a gradual reassessment has occurred. A shift from the tabloid narratives and controversial elements that sometimes dominated coverage of his later years back to the artistic legacy that remains his most meaningful contribution. New generations discover his music without the contextual noise that sometimes surrounded it during his lifetime. Scholarly analyses examine his contributions to dance, to music video as art form, to the integration of global musical influences, to the breaking of racial barriers in entertainment. The human being, complex, flawed, extraordinary in both his gifts and his struggles, gradually emerges from behind the caricature, neither saint nor sinner, but an artist of singular importance whose work continues to resonate across cultural and generational boundaries. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Michael Jackson's final day lies not in the medical details or the subsequent legal proceedings, but in the simple human tragedy of possibilities unrealized, the comeback that never happened, the artistic reinvention cut short, the father who never saw his children grow to adulthood, the man who sought redemption and found instead an ending that seemed at once entirely unexpected and tragically foreseeable. The London concerts, meticulously planned down to the smallest detail, remained unrealized except in the rehearsal footage that later allowed glimpses of what might have been, a bittersweet reminder of the artistic vision that died with him. What remains beyond dispute, beyond the controversies and complexities that characterize his later years, is the transformative power of his art. The music that continues to move bodies and spirits across cultural and linguistic boundaries, the performances that redefined what popular entertainment could encompass, the barriers broken through the sheer force of his talent and vision. In the quiet of 100 North Carrollwood Drive, as dawn broke on June 25, 2009, the physical existence of Michael Jackson came to its end. But the artistic legacy, the revolution in sound and movement and visual storytelling, continues its journey through global culture, touching lives he would never know, inspiring artists not yet born when Thriller first changed the landscape of popular music. If this video has touched you, if it has provided a more human understanding of a figure often reduced to tabloid headlines, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who might appreciate this glimpse beyond the sensationalism that sometimes obscured the artistic brilliance and human complexity of Michael Jackson. And remember that behind every iconic performance, every groundbreaking album, every cultural phenomenon, exists a human being navigating the same fundamental needs and vulnerabilities we all share. Someone seeking connection, meaning, and the peaceful sleep that proved so tragically elusive on that final night in June. In a quiet corner of Forest Lawn Memorial Park, far from the theatrical spectacle that defined so much of his public life, Michael Jackson was laid to rest in September 2009. The private mausoleum, accessible only to family and closest friends, stands in stark contrast to the global stage he commanded for most of his life. Here, there are no spotlights, no choreography, no thousands of voices rising in appreciation of artistic brilliance. Just quiet, just memory, just a final rest that proved so elusive in life. The profound silence of this place perhaps offers its own form of redemption. Not the public vindication he had sought through the London concerts, but a more fundamental peace that transcends the noise of controversy, of fame, of human judgment. Here, finally, Michael Jackson exists beyond the reach of all narratives, but the most essential. An extraordinary artist whose work touched millions, a father whose children remember him with love, a human being whose journey through this world, for all its unprecedented public dimensions, began and ended with the same fundamental experiences we all share, birth and death, with all the complex, messy, beautiful humanity that fills the space between.